Okay, let's dive into a stack of sources today
Yeah.
about a place that, well, one source described it quite beautifully from a distance, like a flat pancake in a flat blue sea,
Mm-hmm.
but with high hills in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Cyprus sitting right out there strategically in the eastern Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
It's positioned, with Turkey north, Egypt south, and kind of nudging up against that coast historically known as Phoenicia. That's modern-day Lebanon, parts of Syria, Israel.
Right.
And one source puts it very clearly. For centuries, this island has been a prize contest.
Yeah.
There's even this intriguing idea presented that for a long time it was almost ignored, green, uninhabited, well, compared to places nearby anyway,
Mm-hmm.
which apparently allowed things like early royal tombs to be excavated unharmed thousands of years later.
And what's just absolutely central here, and you see this in your sources, is how strategic that location is. I mean, it's midway between Egypt, the Levant, that coastline you mentioned, and Anatolia, which is, basically modern Turkey.
Okay.
So this geography meant Cyprus was never really isolated. It was always right in the path of, well, movement, trade, ideas flowing between all these major regions, including the Aegean world to the west.
And that position has clearly shaped, well, everything that came after. So for you, the listener, today we're taking a deep dive into your stack of sources about this incredible island. Our mission is to unpack its really complex history, understand the layers who came, who ruled, and sort of see how the people of Cyprus navigated millennia of constant change.
Yeah, and the sources you've got give us a really fascinating lens. It's a mix, historical overviews, bits from archaeological reports, commentary. It creates what one source calls a patchwork mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to try and help you piece that together.
Okay, so where do we even begin with a history this long?
Well, you have to start right at the beginning, really, with the earliest signs of what our sources are calling advanced human activity. We're talking about really fascinating finds like female figurines made from this very finely prepared clay paste described as using a specific material that was, well, hard to get hold of. And these, along with other objects, they've been found at a potential early settlement site called Campos over in western Cyprus. What's really interesting is one source speculates that the earliest worship of the divine feminine on Cyprus might actually predate these physical figurines themselves.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Suggests a really deep cultural, maybe spiritual root. And then these figurines, they start showing up in graves. What does that tell us about how society was developing?
Exactly. Their presence in graves. That marks a significant shift. It suggests, the beginnings of more complex societal structures and a relatively developed understanding of religion, the afterlife, that kind of thing. You see this even more in the substantial burial rites, evidenced by these elaborate large tombs excavated at Ios Dimitros. That points to a level of social organization, ritual complexity.
Okay, so you've got these early societies developing beliefs,
Yeah.
and then metal enters the picture.
Yes, around the 6th millennium BC, Cyprus enters the Age of Metal.
Okay.
First copper, then later it transitions to bronze. And the sources really emphasize that copper production took off, especially from the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. Cyprus had particularly good quality copper ore, apparently, and using it led to great prosperity for the island.
Right.
This wealth then fueled organized trading networks, which, in turn required administrators at the major sites to manage things, deal with foreign merchants.
So copper wasn't just a resource, it was like an economic engine driving complexity. And you see changes in buildings too, right? What did the sources say about that?
They do. During this Copper Age, we see architectural developments. Constructions like those found at Calabasas Capetra, they move away from simpler rectangular buildings towards more formal structures, which one source describes with terms like towering formal residuals and a frontal emphasis. Think more deliberate, maybe more monumental foundations. And reflecting that growing social hierarchy in the tombs of the elites from this early metal stage, you start finding these large, massive stone vessels among the grave goods.
So copper is bringing prosperity, complexity, but the sources also hint at a downside, or maybe a shift.
Absolutely. The role of copper is highlighted as being aggressively sought and utilized. And while it was huge for the economy, the sources note it later contributed to isolationism and conflicts. Initially, because it was so valuable and the focus was internal production, it kind of formed a strong bulwark against outside cultural influences, which led to what one source calls a precocious phase of development, meaning it developed quite advanced features relatively early compared to some neighbors.
Right.
But this period, described as having an incomparably rich civilization, it takes a dramatic turn. The sources state it was laid waste by the end of the 4th millennium BCE.
Wow, laid waste. That's a dramatic ending to that phase. Speaking of complexity, when does writing show up in this story?
Well, according to your sources, the first known writing from Cyprus is Linear B. This appears later, though, in the late Bronze Age, specifically the last third of the 2nd millennium BC.
And was this widely used? Or is it tied to specific groups?
The sources indicate that this Linear B, it became a tool of government, mostly used by literate officials working at the royal court. They mention large seal inscriptions from the 13th century BC, likely used by the most powerful Cypriot king at Pelopaphos, shows it was used to control the economy. There's an interesting contrast highlighted with a slightly earlier clay token inscription from a provincial center. It's noted as the only known Linear B text, not directly related to the royal court at that specific time.
So quite centralized that.
Seems that way, yeah. Highly centralized. But then this palatial script, it virtually disappeared later on.
So that particular system faded out. But were there other attempts at writing or keeping records?
Yes, and this is where the mystery kind of deepens. The sources mention other early scripts, like Cyprominoian, or scripts found on specific artifacts, and these remain undeciphered or are still, big puzzles for experts. It really highlights the layers of history we can see but don't fully understand yet.
So parts of the record are still locked away.
Yeah.
But we do get a continuous written record later on, right?
That's correct. Despite the undeciphered bits, we do have a continuous record of written evidence from the late Bronze Age onwards, though it's often fragmented. This includes later inscriptions in languages like cuneiform, Phoenician, a local script called Cypro-syllabic, Greek, and Latin. But while they give us valuable details, names, places, organizations, rates of payment, that sort of thing, the sources note they contain only a few sentences of narrative overall.
So we get snapshots rather than the full story from them.
Pretty much, yeah, snapshots. Now, moving into those periods of foreign rule, your sources make it really clear that Cyprus's strategic position, well, it inevitably made it a magnet for the powerful empires surrounding it.
It was just too valuable to ignore, I guess.
Yeah.
Who were some of the big players who took control?
Right. Over centuries, Cyprus was incorporated into various empires. It was part of the Assyrian Empire around 709 BC. There was a brief period of Egyptian rule during the Archaic period, starting notably with Pharaoh Amasis. It submitted to Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and then eventually it was annexed into the Hellenistic Ptolemaic kingdom, the one based in Egypt.
So it's being pulled into all these different orbits, Assyrian, Egyptian, Hellenistic. Yet the sources highlight this fascinating paradox. Despite all these conquests, ancient Cyprus was never directly part of the Greek political world. But Hellenic influence was huge.
Exactly. That's the paradox. It wasn't politically part of Greece proper, but Hellenic influence was massive, especially from at least the 11th century BC onwards, marked by a significant influx of Greek immigrants. Greek culture, Greek language, they really began to take root.
And this influence just grew over time.
Yes, absolutely. Greek became the predominant language for inscriptions, and it served as the common language, the lingua franca, during the later Ptolemaic and Roman periods. However, and your sources make this very important point, despite all this, Cypriot culture during the 1st millennium BC wasn't just a branch of Hellenic culture. It preserved much of its own identity. It absorbed influences, sure, but it kept its own distinct character.
That resilience, that seems like a running theme here. Okay, moving into the Roman period. That followed some dramatic events, apparently.
It did. The sources mention events including the last king, Ptolemy Philopator, dividing the kingdom. And amidst all this turmoil, Cyprus became a Roman province in 58 BC.
How did Rome view Cyprus? Was it just another conquest for them?
Not just another... No, Rome viewed Cyprus as a most coveted desire. Your sources describe it as the richest and most populous island in the Eastern Archipelago. It was important for its resources, especially copper still, and its crucial political position. They also include this unusual narrative around the involvement of the Roman statesman Cato during this transition. While Roman figures often sought wealth or position, the sources suggest Cato's motives went beyond that, focusing on a perceived crime, which adds a kind of unique twist to Rome's early interactions with the island.
Interesting.
And the sources briefly mention the subsequent transitions too, like the island's appropriation after a Roman civil war and its final formal incorporation into the empire in 15 AD. after Actium.
Okay. And once it was fully Roman, what was that period like?
Well, what followed is often described as the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, and that generally led to a time of prosperity and flourishing city-states on the island. We see evidence of continued divine worship and, importantly, missionary activity. Your sources note that Christianity was introduced to Cyprus pretty early, by the time of the Apostles.
Wow.
And significantly, after Christianity became the imperial religion in AD 392, Cyprus was the second province in the empire to fall under ecclesiastic jurisdiction. That highlights its early importance in the Christian world.
So a really significant place in early Christianity.
Definitely. Then, from Roman rule, the island transitions into the Byzantine period, where for several centuries it was essentially a fiefdom of the Byzantine Empire, headquartered in Constantinople.
But it wasn't exactly a straightforward period under Byzantium either?
No, not at all. It was contested. It suffered from Arab raids, and while it remained under Byzantine administration in name by the late 8th century, the sources say it came under the de facto control of the Umayyad Caliphate.
Right. So caught between Byzantium and the Arab world.
Precisely. It was eventually reconquered by Byzantium, but your sources mention continued frictions and raids from Muslim forces. Then, quite dramatically, in 1191, Richard III of England shows up during the Third Crusade.
Richard the Lionheart.
The very same. He conquers it from the Byzantines, and, well, not really wanting to hold it long term, he subsequently sells the island after accepting a large sum of money.
And who buys it?
This sale leads to the rule of the French Latin House of Lusignan. They were a Crusader family. Your sources note they had full sovereign powers over Cyprus itself, but were technically forced to become vassals of the King of Jerusalem. Latin became an official language for administration alongside others. The sources also touch on some internal church issues during this time, like something referred to as the Synod of Bailies, whatever that was. And they note that the Church of Cyprus gained the right to elect its own bishops, which was a significant point for local autonomy.
And after the Lusignans, who was next?
After them, the island was ruled by an ethnic Greek dynasty until 1473, after which it was sold again, this time to Venice.
Ah, the Venetians.
Yes. Your sources describe this as about a century of inconsequential Venetian rule, which was largely marked by conflict against the rising Ottoman power. And according to one source you've shared, the Venetian administration even launched a campaign specifically targeting Turkish and Arabic-speaking communities. It cites examples of extreme cruelty by officials like Ferduco Pagnano towards the people of Nicosia right before the final Ottoman conquest.
So Venice struggled to hold on and, according to this source at least, was also pretty harsh internally.
That's the picture painted by this particular source, yes. And ultimately, Venice failed. The island was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1571 after a tough 3-month siege of the capital. And this conquest, it ushered in a really long period, over 300 years of Ottoman rule, from 1571 all the way to 1878. Your sources note that after the conquest, something like 30,000 Turks were sent from the mainland. This established a significant Turkish element in the island's population that, persists today.
Yeah, there's one point your source makes about this long Ottoman period that's particularly striking, isn't it? Kind of stands out.
It really is. According to one source, during this entire long period, from 1571 to 1878, there was, quote, no overt conflict between the Turks and Greeks of the island, only sporadic skirmishes. Now, it's important to note, as the source kind of implicitly acknowledges by making it a point, that this view contrasts with some other historical narratives.
Right.
But this is what your source states.
That's a fascinating perspective to consider. And the sources detail other significant changes under the Ottomans as well.
Yes, they highlight several key reforms. The Ottomans abolished feudalism and serfdom, which ended what one source specifically calls the inhuman Latin persecution that Greek-speaking Christians experienced under the previous Lusignan rule.
Okay.
They also introduced a system where villages were placed under the civilian rule of Christian headmen, allowing for a degree of local management.
And there was a crucial point regarding the Greek Orthodox Church.
Absolutely crucial, yes. The Greek Orthodox Church was officially recognized as an autocephalous, self-governing archbishopric. This was hugely significant. It gave the church the right to collect taxes and regulate Greek Cypriots' social, educational, and religious affairs.
Wow. So this provided a structured form of autonomy, really, through the church itself.
That's the argument one source makes, yes. It suggests this arrangement gave Greek Cypriots a measure of self-government and autonomy centered around that church structure. This source then goes on to discuss the island's identity. stating that while Cyprus certainly has a uniquely Greek character in its language and culture, it insists it cannot be said that it is a historically Greek island.
Interesting distinction.
Yeah, the source maintains that Cyprus belongs to all of its inhabitants, who share a similar culture and history. It presents the idea of it belonging exclusively to Greeks as something that emerged much later, specifically with late 19th century nationalism.
So that source offers a specific interpretation, framing modern nationalism as the real point of division, rather than earlier historical periods.
Okay, shifting forward then, what happens in 1878?
In 1878, the island was acquired by the British Empire. Your sources describe it as being handed over to England from Turkey. Initially, it wasn't full annexation, but for administration, primarily due to its strategic importance in the Eastern Med. And the source you shared notes, rather pointedly, that the inhabitants themselves were not consulted about this transfer of power.
Right. And under British rule, did the dynamics on the island change?
Fundamentally, yes. Under British rule, the sources indicate that Greek Cypriots began to agitate strongly for union with Greece, that movement known as enosis.
Enosis.
Exactly. And simultaneously, Turkish Cypriots strongly opposed this. This core dynamic, highlighted by the sources, became a really significant source of tension and led to escalating crises over the following decades.
This takes us towards the period leading up to independence, then? Yes. Cyprus eventually gained independence on August 16, 1960. This followed a treaty agreed upon by the key external powers, the UK, Greece, and Turkey. As part of this arrangement, a Greek Cypriot became president, and a Turkish Cypriot became vice president, a power-sharing setup.
But this new independent state, it didn't achieve stability, according to the sources. Sounds like it was fraught from the start.
Unequivocally, one source states that the conditions laid out in that independence treaty were never implemented. It attributes this failure to what it describes as Greek Cypriot intransigence, complacency, and insensitivity. Harsh words. The sources paint a picture of increasing turmoil, noting how the initial hope, or maybe the myth of a Mediterranean island of peace, became more and more tarnished.
The period following independence sounds incredibly difficult. The sources detail a rise in violence.
They do. The period after 1960 is described as one of escalating intercommunal tension and violence. One source states bluntly that riotous attacks were taking place on the island almost every day. It provides specific, harrowing details from the 1963 Bringaz riot, as is described in that source. It recounts that the riot began after what it calls a rude quarrel and tragically resulted in 286 Turkish Cypriot deaths, 103 injuries, property damage valued at $1 million, and the displacement of 948 people.
That's awful.
The source adds details like the desecration of mosques and the trampling of Turkish flags, stating that in that incident there was no property left untouched. Just devastating.
Those are grim details indeed. The sources also mention the political climate alongside this violence, what was being said.
Yes, they reflect the deteriorating political situation. This included statements like the Turkish Cypriot leader Fazıl Küçük's view that a clean separation with autonomy for the Turkish Cypriots was now the only solution. The sources also include mentions of specific disturbing acts of violence during this period, such as pigs' heads have been displayed and threats of bringing rats into the Turkish courts also made as part of this really toxic atmosphere of intercommunal strife.
This period of tension and violence then culminated in a major event in 1974.
It did. On July 15, 1974, a coup d'etat was staged. It was carried out by a group of Greek Cypriot military officers who were aided by the ruling Greek junta in Athens at the time. This coup overthrew President Makarios, who, while Greek Cypriot himself was seen by some, particularly the coup leaders, as less committed to immediate union with Greece enosis than they wanted.
Okay, and what was the immediate consequence for the population, particularly Turkish Cypriots, during that coup?
The consequence described in the source is that during the instability caused by the coup, Turkish Cypriots fled into enclaves or deserted areas where they could practice communal self-government. This movement created these areas of concentrated Turkish Cypriot population, often under very difficult circumstances.
And this set the stage for Turkey's military action just days later.
Yes, exactly. 5 days later, on July 20th, 1974, the event described by the source as Turkey invading Cyprus occurred. This military action resulted in Turkey gaining control over 30% of the island, specifically the northern part, and that has remained under Turkish control to this day.
What were the overall impacts of that event as summarized by the sources? It sounds massive.
The sources summarize the profound impacts. Hundreds of civilian deaths, the massive displacement of populations, including effectively the entire Turkish Cypriot population being displaced either during earlier periods of violence or in 1974. One source mentions specifically 120,000 refugees between 1955 and 1984. This led to the creation of a Turkish Cypriot state in the north. And the sources also note the subsequent demographic changes in northern Cyprus due to the settlement of Turks from mainland Turkey, which one source specifically refers to as colonization.
So after 1974, the island is effectively divided, and these issues become international problems, big political footballs.
Precisely. After 1974, the division of the island, the refugee issue, these became significant international political issues. And the sources highlight the competing narratives surrounding the events of 74. One side views Turkey's action as an intervention aimed at protecting the Turkish Cypriot community,
Right.
while the other side sees it as subjugation and invasion. And different governments around the world have declared their positions on which claim holds legitimacy. Your sources neutrally report these different claims and the international stances.
And that leads eventually to the declaration of the TRNC.
Yes. The Declaration of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the TRNC, in March 1983 is mentioned. The sources state that its claim to statehood has only been granted by Turkey and that the United Nations regards it as a self-proclaimed area of separatist Turkish Cypriot entity and condemned the declaration. Again, the sources are just reporting these facts about the international position without taking a side themselves.
Okay, wow. We've covered millennia of history and significant periods of conflict and change.
Yeah.
Deep breaths. But despite all of that, what enduring threads run through Cypriot identity? Let's maybe shift gears a bit and look at the island's cultural heritage.
Yeah, it's actually remarkable how much has survived. Despite millennia of external influences, internal upheaval, Cyprus has maintained this incredibly rich tradition in arts and crafts, a legacy noted even back in antiquity. Your sources give wonderful examples: carving, woodwork, embroidery, pottery making, weaving. They also mention ancient artifacts found, like sculptured stone plates, terracotta statuettes, miniature pottery vases, and beautiful jewelry made from various materials. It shows these skills go way, way back.
And it's not just ancient history, right? Many of these traditions are still alive today.
They absolutely are. And the sources highlight how many handmade crafts still flourish and are called emblematic of Cyprus's cultural identity. They use quilting as a lovely example, describing it as symbolizing all that is beautiful and precious out of happiness, used for incredibly practical things like covering fishermen's nets, but also for deeply personal items like a bride's dowry.
That's beautiful.
Rugs are also mentioned with their specific materials and designs, including the fascinating use of a scorpion motif representing fertility. And of course, they mention the exquisite Paphos ceramics, which are famous for their beauty.
So the crafts endure. What about something as fundamental as food? How has the cuisine been shaped by all these different influences over time?
Well, food habits are often very tenacious, very resistant to change, but they are still subject to influence over time. Your sources note impacts from various seafaring peoples who visited or settled, the Arabian vector, which introduced key items like olives, mulberries, peaches, oranges, and lemons quite early on, and even Persian influence, bringing things like spices, pungent salt fish, sweet pastes, pickles, and syrups.
That paints a picture of a truly blended, layered cuisine. Delicious sounding, too. And the sources even have a charming little anecdote about Cypriot cooks.
They do, and it speaks volumes about the pride in their traditions, I think. The sources show that Cypriots could be quite reluctant to share their cooking secrets. When pressed, they would apparently respond with this wonderful line, "A man of honor never gives up the secret of his cooking, not even in death."
Oh, love that.
So yeah, bringing it back to the big picture, what your sources really reveal is how Cyprus's unique geographical position has consistently placed it at this crossroads, constantly desired and shaped by empires and peoples from both east and west, time and time again.
And as one source concludes, despite this incredibly tumultuous history, Cyprus ultimately belongs to all of its inhabitants, who share this deep, complex history and culture. As we've seen, the archaeology, historical records, this patchwork mosaic of information, it reveals these intricate layers of interaction and development over 10 millennia. It's staggering, really.
It really is.
So for you, the listener, here's a final thought drawn from the sources we've explored today. Given this incredibly long history of external forces reshaping the island, and the more recent, painful internal divisions we've discussed, how do those deep roots of shared Cypriot culture and heritage, The crafts, the food, the sense of identity. How do they persist and define the island today, alongside its very real political realities? What does this long view, this 10,000-year perspective from your sources, what does it tell us about the powerful relationship between geography, the forces of history, and the enduring resilience of a people and their culture? Something to keep thinking about.
That mosaic.